So first, I would like to present Claudia Rojas, who goes by the pronouns of she and ella. She is a poeta and community advocate from El Salvador who lives in Virginia. Claudia is pursuing an MFA at the University of Maryland, College Park. Her poetry appears in the Acentos Review, the Northern Virginia Review, and elsewhere. For more info, please visit claudiapoet.com, and I will go ahead and put the link to her website in the chat. And then the next person that I would like to introduce is Clara Maria Apostolatos, who is a graduate with a BA in art history from Columbia University. She graduated in 2020. Wait, what is going on here? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I am sorry. Zoom just makes everything so, all right. And her research interests include modern and contemporary art of Latin America, institutional critique, and the politics of testimony. She is particularly interested in art that provides testimony for incomplete or inverted accounts of authoritarian past in Latin America. She has held positions at the Guggenheim Museum, Art Book, the AP, SAPAR, Contemporary Art Gallery, and the Center for Italian Modern Art. In the fall of 2021, she will be enrolling in the Courtauld Institute of Arts MA in Art History. And then last but not least, Brandon Sword will be presenting. Brandon Sword is an artist, writer, and doctoral candidate at the University of Chicago who lives and works in Los Angeles. He was a quarterfinalist for the Vandermeer Nonfiction Prize, was shortlisted for Disquiet International's Literary Prize, and was an honorable mention and finalist for the New Millennium Writing Awards. He's won residencies at the Alternative Worksite, Birdcliff, the Hambidge Center, and the Institute for LGBTQ+ Studies, Main Street Arts, and I'm just gonna stop it there. There's a lot. All right, so I will go ahead and turn it over to Claudia first, and I will put the websites of the authors in the chat.
Right, so thank you, Nancy. Hola, everybody. My name is Claudia Rojas. I'm currently located in Falls Church, Virginia. I'm a graduate student in the University of Maryland's MFA program, and I'm graduating this semester. And I'm very grateful to be part of this panel, which is happening during National Poetry Month. And I'm grateful to everybody at the Latin American Student Study Center. This is my second time being part of one of the conferences, and I just feel really wonderful each time that I am present. So I've titled my short talk, Breaking Lines for Resistance. As a poet, I break lines, holding the reader in suspension from one end of the line to the next. What the line break does in a poem is make language surprising. The task of the poet is not to bore the reader, but I am a brown poet, so I do more than not bore the reader. I like to challenge them. I invite them to get to know me, to love language, and to question it with me. Today, I want to share a few poems. To begin, I want to share in Ars Poetica, a poem that tells you about the poet's belief. I'll read this poem twice. The poem was published in La Presa, a bilingual journal based in Canada. So the first poem, I'll read it in English. Ars Poetica. I can do one thing, and at least it's mine. I compose these poems for our survival. I will do the work because poems have done their share by outliving me. Es que yo, como Roque Dalton, río por los ojos. A poet tries poetry, and I'm so much a person. I like the way my voice fills a room, and sometimes I don't know. Some days I can't make myself write this life, and on the harder days I don't see any good in poemas, buenos para nada, and not enough. But I don't tell the page this. My words will never sentence the rapist or reverse the refugee's persecution. I've tried to get the page off itself. I am trying still. So is this a confession, or is it some portion of the truth in my everyday, because this life is too much to hold? A poet writes to the living. Sometimes I arrive to this life con poco aliento, my fingers trying to uncurl. Enter, oh prayer, enter prayer. Arte Poética. Puedo hacer una cosa, y por lo menos es mía. Yo redacto estos poemas para nuestra supervivencia. Yo haré el trabajo, porque los poemas ya han hecho su parte viviendo más que yo. Es que yo, como Roque Dalton, río por los ojos. Una poeta intenta la poesía, pero yo soy mucha persona. Me gusta la manera en que mi voz llena un espacio y a veces no me gusta. No lo sé. Ciertos días no puedo obligarme a escribir esta vida. Y en los días más difíciles no veo nada bueno en los good for nothing poems. Y no son suficientes. Sin embargo, no se lo digo a la página. Mis palabras jamás condenarán al violador o revertirán la persecución del refugiado. He tratado de quitar a la página de sí misma. Sigo intentándolo. Entonces, esto es una confesión o es parte de la verdad de mi vida día a día, porque esta vida es demasiado para sostener. Un poeta, una poeta, escribe para los vivos y a veces llego a esta vida out of breath, mis dedos intentando desenroscarse, entrar en una oración, entrar en oración. The next poem that I would like to read is called My Feet Can Walk. In the middle of the summer, she tells a friend, my feet can walk like through deserts. She means she took a desert to get here. His face unsettles, says don't tell people those things, except for she does, because living to tell doesn't mean she remembers how, except for her feet bore witness to ground, to water, and to air, to entry point, Phoenix, Arizona, the cell, and maybe the phone call to dad. No one taught her. Borders are built, that they follow you, barking at every entry point, zigzag line. At the immigration center, an official speaks in Spanish about her prints. She has thin, difficult fingers. If she wants to speed the process, she must relax. She takes care to swallow the hurt. There's a compartment in her chest to keep feelings like these, feelings that her feet can't step over, rather circle like a spade-foot toad out for the monsoon. That toad longs to sprint onto an open ground, adapt in time. She wishes for a summer, for feet that knew the land. It's hard to bear witness. Now, let me tell you what these poems begin to reveal to you. I say begin because one never stops learning about a person. I honor my heritage. I was born in El Salvador to a mother who lived through the entirety of the Salvadorian Civil War. I am a third generation Leo. Yes, this means my mother and my grandmother were born in August. My brown body is a working body. I live in the US through a humanitarian program known as Temporary Protected Status, TPS for short, which enables an immigrant to work legally in the US provided their country of origin is approved for TPS. Some of those designated TPS countries are Sudan, Haiti, Nepal, Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador. For me, poetry is not just about creative expression, it's human expression. I write poetry because in poetry, I can write myself human. I can take up space. In poetry, I can write about the people that don't make mainstream news, like the TPS holders in Washington, D.C., who have been on a hunger strike for several weeks, demanding that President Biden push harder for permanent legal protection for immigrants. These TPS holders will end their 43-day hunger strike tomorrow. To learn more about these TPS holders, visit the TPS National Alliance on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Because of TPS, over 300,000 immigrants live in perpetual anxiety, thinking uncertain about their legal future, access to healthcare or jobs or families. TPS operates under the assumption that a person needs only temporary protection, and Congress has not yet presented a permanent solution to the thousands of immigrants contributing to the US economy, who pay taxes, who may not benefit from Social Security if they are deported. For decades, TPS has been absent from the speeches of US presidents. It took racist language around TPS for TPS to be noticed, and at that time, it has been terminated. So there's a lot of risk for TPS holders right now, for myself. So when I say that TPS was first noticed because of the language that it was used around it by former President Trump, I mean that language matters. I want to take a moment here to remind us that all immigrants come in all shapes, all races, and all backgrounds. When I was accepted to UMD fall 2019, my acceptance letter asked about my work permit. And so this has been the pattern of my life in most workplaces and all the colleges I attended. HR tells me we accept you conditionally. At UMD, I found community in the undocumented and immigrant student program. And to learn more about this program, please visit their Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The poem, the page, it accepts me fully. I want to invite you to read poetry this month, this National Poetry Month. It's the Poetry Academy is celebrating its 25th year, celebrating this month. So a few poets that are dear to me that I recommend are Andrea Gibson, Ocean Vuong, Langston Hughes, Maya Angelou, Leticia Hernandez Linares, Alan Pelayas Lopez, Javier Zamora, Ada Limon, among many other voices. To close, I share one more poem. And this was published in the Midwest Quarterly. Quarterly is a poem entitled In Praise of Myself, and it begins with a little quote by Lucille Clifton. The Clifton quote is, "If there is a river more beautiful than this." And that's where the quote ends. I am now woman, yo soy, my own elaborate flesh, morena, brown, melanin, like I'm not from here, because here is cement and earth, and my body is a manifestation of my soul, and my soul no es de aquí. I am a testament to my pulse. I made this body a home, despite the men with one life, and after the Genesis, I lived through times when the sky was a mocking blue to the fog of myself. I endure rooms populated by men wanting my choices. I am at the border with my body, and this body is blood, and it will be mine. I hold gratitude for my working cells that survived an unforgiving desert. My working cells hold me. I survived my parents' shipwreck union. I woke to my nightmares of becoming a foreign landscape. I made it past the year of undoing, the year without future, the que será de mí. When no one speaks, I do. I am. Yo soy. A fine feminine wonder. Soy un comienzo. My life is grand enough to chart by my own timeline. I lead by my life, do by this body, do by the lives saved for me, those unpaved roads I will navigate. I love it here in my body, where I never know the answers, where I hurt beside the sunrise, where I look after myself. I'm going to walk through the dark, meet up with the day, be seed and fire. If my power depends upon surviving, so what? The world is built upon the sunrising of wombs. And that ends my poem. To learn more about me, visit claudiapoet.com or follow me on Instagram at claudiapoet or Twitter claudia_poet. And once again, thank you to everybody for your engagement, and I'm very grateful to be part of this panel, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. If you want, you can put your info in the chat so the other participants could see it. But next, I want to introduce Clara Maria Apostolatos to go ahead and give her presentation.
Thank you. Great. Could you enable screen sharing, please? Great, thanks. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank all the organizers of this conference for inviting me to speak today. My talk will center on an artist who works to dismantle complex webs of core capitalism, landscapes of civil conflict, and the hegemonic development of the periphery. Originating from a context scarred by these sociopolitical power structures, she's an artist whose work has been described as reflecting periodicity in the periphery by documenting and subverting the forgetting of individuals and the conditions in which they died. Teresa Margolles is a conceptual artist who researches, documents, and demands attention to social ruptures produced by violence, particularly deaths caused by drug-related crime, poverty, and alienation. She's originally from Culiacán, a town in northwestern Mexico scarred by systematic violence. As a former mortician, Margolles witnessed large numbers of unidentified bodies, the anonymous victims of drug-related violence, pass through the morgue. The bodies Margolles encountered were often buried in anonymous graves, or if the families and friends couldn't afford a burial at all, they were cremated. Over the past 3 decades, Margolles has created sculptural objects, public performances, and photographs as a way of uncovering the treatment of unclaimed and anonymous corpses in mortuary institutions. She uses a wide variety of materials that have come in contact with the dead or are direct links to the sites of violence. Some examples can be leftover sutures from autopsies, such as in 127 Cuerpos, or maybe cloths soaked in blood, such as in narcomensajes, or water that was used to clean bodies in the morgue that have then been turned into pebbles. Margolles lets parts of bodies, residues of bodies, and materials like cloth and water that come in close contact with the corpse represent the victims in efforts to facilitate visibility of victims, corpses, and corruption. While forensic tools and postmortem substances are the raw materials in the majority of her work, she does not work directly with the body, but rather with the remaining wounds on the social fabric. Margolles' art practice in the 90s was anchored by a deep urgency to call attention to and record drug-related crime occurring in Mexican border communities. These themes of systematic violence and exclusion in the periphery recall the framework of necropower, a term coined by philosopher and political theorist Achille Mbembe to describe the use of social and political power to dictate how some people may live and how some must die. Necropolitics draws from the confinement or the spatial exclusion of certain populations that result in the reduction of people to precarious conditions of life. Mbembe describes these spaces as death realms where people are kept alive but in a state of injury, in a phantom-like world of horrors and intense cruelty and profanity. Favelas, prisons, and borders are examples of spaces which the state deems dead realms. Ultimately, necropower works toward the creation of death realms, these new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life, conferring upon them the status of living dead. Under everyday necropolitics, populations live under extreme precarious conditions, and as such, they can be exploited and eliminated. I think this concept is best summarized as, to quote Mbembe, the capacity to define who matters and who does not, who is disposable and who is not. Following this line of thought, necropolitics can serve as a framework to understand how governments assign differential value to human life, where the farther away you are from access of privilege, the less your life is worth, under the logics of necropolitics. Historically and at present, we can see necropolitics as a manifestation of capitalism and its related institutions of violence. Some cases that come to mind are the HIV/AIDS crisis, COVID-19, policing, and forced sterilization of people in prison. In these examples, institutional violence and inequality determine who is disposable and therefore able to be managed via death. Returning to Teresa Margolles, I find that necropolitics is a useful framework when looking at her context of operation and intentions as an artist. For today's talk, I will outline how the work of Teresa Margolles serves to bear witness to the power structures that underlie violence and civil death in peripheral communities. That is, the necropower enforced upon marginalized identities. My presentation centers on three particular subjectivities explored and represented in Margolles' work. The first is migrants and displaced individuals. Margolles has created an expansive body of work on migration, displacement, and border violence. While living and working in Juarez in the early 2000s, Margolles made several pieces that addressed and memorialized the extremely high homicide rate in one of the most hostile borders on the planet. Among her most well-known pieces is Muro Baleado, a wide stretch of concrete brick wall riddled with bullet holes. It attests to everyday violence in Margolles' hometown, Culiacán, where fighting between federal police and drug cartels is particularly intense. I find that this piece exemplifies Margolles' aims at presenting rather than representing these subjectivities. She transports signs and residues of violence that already exist in the urban landscape and affixes them to the gallery space, where we can reflect on that trauma. In artwork that emphasizes Margolles' call for public commemoration of border violence is the installation La Gran América, a wall-mounted grid of 1,000 hand-molded ceramic tiles made from mud taken from Rio Grande, which is the river and natural border that divides Mexico and the United States. According to Margolles, each block stands in for a person who died or disappeared trying to cross the border into the United States. The size of the tiles in La Gran América references the Stolperstein, or stumbling stones, that the German artist Gunter Demnig conceived in 1992. This is an ongoing, decentralized memorial to Holocaust victims, in which 20 by 20 centimeter concrete cubes are embedded in the street outside victims' last known residences. Each stone is topped with a brass plate inscribed "Here lived," the name of the victim, date of birth, and if available, the conditions or place of their death, including suicide, exile, deportation, and internment. Over 70,000 of these memorial cubes have been laid across Europe. La Gran América is a memorial to the many migrants who lose their lives trying to cross the river, giving a critical attention to the anonymization of the dead and the disappearance of bodies. Unlike the Stolperstein, these ceramic tiles have no markers or names. Rather, they maintain the anonymity of victims. The only knowledge viewers have is of the place of disappearance and or death. The materiality of the tiles recalls the conditions and context that produces disappearances. In this case, border violence and conflict. Literally and symbolically, Margolles puts on display the actual border. Earth and mud from the border is assembled in a grid composition that resembles a brick wall. She takes something fluid and organic like mud and makes it solid and fabricated. As a result, the work gestures to the arbitrariness of the border, which, in actuality, is nothing but earth, but in our world divides affliction from opportunity. By destabilizing conventional notions of a border as something secure and immovable, Margolles invites us to think of the Mexican citizens who attempted to cross, not as illegal immigrants or criminals, but as victims of violent persecution and threatening conditions, as civilians who deserve commemoration and consideration of the conditions that force them to migrate from their homes. La Gran América, like many of Margolles' works, anchors the memory of the anonymous dead and missing. I will quickly note that since her works that were based on Juarez, Margolles has increasingly exhibited and worked on an international scale. Her research and work has started to extend beyond the issue of Mexican border violence and consider other contexts. 4 years ago, Margolles traveled for the first time to Cúcuta, a city that has been witnessing for many years the Venezuelan exodus. The Venezuelan displacement crisis is only surpassed in magnitude by Syria, but it is happening without being in a war or natural catastrophe. The displacement of poverty-stricken people from Venezuela is part of the larger consequences of the brutality of Latin American governments, which has been a longtime subject for Margolles, who does fieldwork in conflict areas, engaging with victims and producing videos, photography, and installations across the globe. To document the Venezuelan exodus, Margolles organized and enacted several actions. For one of them, pictured here, She hired Venezuelans to carry stones across the river that geopolitically divides the border with Colombia. For another, she hired the migrants to knit their narratives into fabrics stained by the local soil. Margolles also bought used sweat-stained t-shirts from the immigrants, which she later used to create an installation about the fluids of labor and border crossers. During all of these performances, the manual labor was accompanied by conversations and documentation by the artist, so that her work stands in as an archive of these displayed individuals' experiences and subjectivities. In these pieces, there are recurring themes of exclusions from opportunity, security, and adequate life. They illustrate how human displacement is part of the biopolitical constitution of society and its values. Margolles also explores the issue of state power differentiating and governing the life of female populations. Femicide refers to the homicide of women, and specifically the violation of female human rights that occur when historical and social conditions allow for violent attempts against the integrity, health, liberties, and lives of girls and women. As the number of disappeared and murdered women and girls continues to rise, Margolles has created works that highlight this gendered violence, while also considering the compliance of citizens. Sonidos de la Muerte is a sound installation of several audio recordings of the places where the bodies of murdered women were found. Sounds of cars, conversations, children playing, and other seemingly quotidian sounds contrast with the knowledge that they are from a specific site of murder, stressing the fact that many such crimes go unremembered and forgotten. Margolles points to the oblivion crimes inevitably fall into, highlighting the negligence of crime enforcement and the disavowed unawareness of citizens who populate the crime-ridden area. Meanwhile, La Búsqueda is an installation of glass panels taken from outside a train station in Juárez, where people compiled multiple posters declaring women missing and asking for information. Recording of the train that crosses Juárez is turned into a frequency and blasted into the room, causing the panels to tremble, thus recreating a sensory experience of an approaching train. These panels serve as architectural traces of tragic crimes and testify to the pain family members undergo in their search for loved ones. Damaged and carrying signs having been posted for an extended time, the posters also hint at the resolution of these cases. The accusation here is that the posters on the panels and the missing women became transparent to people because the high number of missing people in posters, buried under each other, become a part of everyday life. Both La Búsqueda and Sonidos de la Muerte show how public spaces are indices of pain and absence. Citizens, by accepting them as normalized aspects of everyday life, contribute to the passive acceptance, silence, and obliviousness that surround the problem. Finally, one of Margolles' focuses in the last decade deals with the brutality towards queer and trans populations and the subsequent state-sponsored impunity of the murderers. Since the 1990s, Ciudad Juárez has experienced several attempts to regenerate its city center. Rundown central areas have been cleared in order to foster urban regeneration, targeting in particular low-income populations and sex workers. According to Margolles, the relocation of sex workers from downtown indicates a cleansing of society towards the trading of potentially valuable urban real estate, and is also linked to the violence that the whole country, and especially this city, has been suffering throughout the last decade. During the most recent phase of this process, numerous houses and establishments were either abandoned due to drug and violence-related pressures or closed down by the authorities. Many of these buildings have been demolished, among others, nightclubs. This piece features a fragment of the dance floor from the Lago Blanco nightclub that was extracted from the demolished site. The floor has been reassembled and displayed on the wall in a way that allows us to inhabit the atmosphere of a dismantled town. In documenting these charged evictions, Teresa Margolles has focused on transgender sex workers. apart from exclusion and discrimination, transsexuals in Latin America are exposed to a higher rate of hate-related murders. The transgender sex workers of Ciudad Juarez are being pressed to leave the city center, as their usual working places are being demolished. Their efforts to remain downtown are efforts to survive and subvert the relocation plan that counts on profiting in the future from their disappearance. In this photographic series, titled Pistas de Baile, Margolles' subjects stand on the remnants of the former dance floors of demolished nightclubs where they used to work. Each color print is named after the venue that once stood there. Their figures become part of a landscape in which ruins and devastation are the subject. Nonetheless, the figures stand proud, showing us their best self in uniform, as if they were asserting themselves amidst both violence and destruction. This is an ongoing project and it received special attention in Zurich when Teresa Margolles had to deal with the brutal murder of one of the transgenders, Carla, who was beat to death in 2015. A specific memorial was created in her name. Through this brief overview of Margolles' work, I hope to have communicated that Margolles wants to rescue victims of violence from invisibility, and by heightening the issue of the normality of nameless and anonymous death, draw attention to the government's ineffectual response to social conflicts that have devastated border communities. To be more exact, and to use the artist's own words, she is concerned with the life of the corpse, by which she means the fate of the bodies, what they experience after their death, and the connections between their lives before and their lives after death. Circumstances such as cause of death and age at death, and the chosen forms of burial and commemoration are all directly contingent on social, economic, and political conditions. To borrow from Julia Banwell, Margolles documents the social injustices in Mexican streets that carry over to the morgue, tracing the narrative of the dead body beyond the physical point of death and focusing on the life of the corpse from the morgue onward. Membe's description of death realms from his 2003 article, Necropolitics, blur the margins between life and death so that they are not as obvious in opposing biological states. I will repeat it, the capacity to define who matters and who does not, who is disposable and who is not. Margolles similarly reveals the complex social relations between conditions of life and death, specifically aiming to dispel the idea that death is an equalizer and that the inequalities experienced in life can continue to exist after death. That is, she's interested in the biopolitical regulation of life as much as the necropolitics concerned with vulnerable populations. As has been noted by writer Octavio Paz, by means of artistic intervention, Teresa Margolles transports past life into a state of perceptibility, thus wresting the dead from anonymity and oblivion, and in effect, eliminating the distance we usually place between ourselves and the dead. This process of reintegrating the dead into the social body carries a concern for the recovery of the past. Margolles vindicates the victims and proclaims their right to be remembered and grieved. Along these lines, Margolles' works can present a positive contribution in necropolitics, a positive means of creating and rebuilding community through the practice of remembering and caring for the dead, through commemoration, memorial, burial, and remembrance, oftentimes seeped in tradition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clara. That was such a moving and powerful piece. I want to turn it over to Brandon Swarp.
Before we do that, Nancy, I just want to point out to the attendees that we've heard some really wonderful presentations so far, and I'm sure everyone has questions that they would like to pose. And so we want to let you know that the Q&A is available. If there are questions that occur to you while the presentations are happening, you can go ahead and put your questions in there and we'll take them at the end. But for now, I'm sure we're very excited to hear from Brandon. So we'll hand over to him. Brandon, you have control of the presentation.
Hey guys, thanks so much for coming to my performance. So this is a piece about Santa Fe. If you haven't had the pleasure of going, I highly recommend it. When the sun sets, everything glows pink. Golden light lava pours over the Sangre de Cristo mountains like broken egg yolk. Sorry, I'm getting distracted. One of the first things you'll notice about Santa Fe is how old it is. I'm talking like real old, like older than the US old. Before it was the capital of New Mexico, Santa Fe was the capital of Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico, a province of New Spain. Anyway, the Age of Discovery, as those European pricks like to call it, meant the conquest of the Americas, not just by the Spaniards, but also, of course, the British. While the 13 colonies got their revolution off with a bang in 1776, shit didn't pop off in Mexico until 1810. But queen that she is, Santa Fe was fought over by Agro men, claimed both by Mexico and the fledgling Republic of Texas in the 1830s and 1840s. When Texan President Mirabeau Lamar attempted to gain control of the lucrative Santa Fe Trail, his disastrous defeat spelled the end of Texas as an independent nation. Although the US annexed the state in 1845, any Texan is quick to remind you of their brief spell of independence, and that's why they can have their flag at the same height as the US flag, blah, blah, blah. Well, it turns out 1845 was a big year, because that's also when James Polk became presidente numero 11 and tried to buy the provinces of Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico and Alta California. The Mexicans were not interested. But like a prissy white dude, Polk sent troops into the disputed territories on purpose. And when Mexican forces retaliated, he cried invasion and turned around to get a declaration of war from Congress. The Mexican-American War didn't go so hot for our southern neighbors, and US troops pushed them all the way back to Mexico City, where a chastened government was forced to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which Mexico ceded 529,000 square miles of territory to the US, its largest land acquisition since the Louisiana Purchase. Santa Fe and its trail were now firmly under US control. Despite its logistical importance, however, some early visitors were not impressed with the remote town, one remarking, "I can hardly imagine how Santa Fe is supported. The country around it is barren. At the north stands a snow-capped mountain, while the valley in which the town is situated is drab and sandy. The streets are narrow. A Mexican will walk about all day to sell a bundle of grass worth about a dime. They are the poorest looking people I ever saw. They subsist principally on mutton, onions, and red pepper." Or at least that's how I imagined them sounding. As the railroad stretched west, Santa Fe was envisioned as a stop on the Atichen, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, but the engineers eventually decided against it. Although a branch line later connected it, the economic damage was already done. But at the same time, artists and writers flocked to the city like migrating birds, in part due to their fascination with the Pueblo peoples settled along the Santa Fe River. The city council developed a plan to capitalize on the town's unique culture. They asserted, "It should be the duty of all city officials to guard the old streets against any change that will affect their appearance, until proper assurance is given that the architecture will conform exteriorly with the Santa Fe style." But what is the Santa Fe style? A few years before this fateful decision, a young archaeologist named Jesse Nussbaum began renovating Santa Fe's Palace of the Governors, the oldest continually occupied public building in the US. In his journal, he stressed, "The palace was begun with an adaptation to climate and atmosphere and had been fitted into the color of earth and sky. Here was a need to eliminate excrescences, substituting nothing and holding to the old natural lines." Ugh, excrescences. In any case, the result was a blend of Puebloan, Spanish, and territorial styles. Even though Nussbaum came up with the style, this architect, John Gaw Meem, was definitely its biggest fanboy. Meem came to the city after catching tuberculosis in 1920, back when folks thought the high desert could dry out all that nasty lung gunk, that the mere air could make them strong and bold and certain. I know it's fucked to romanticize a deadly disease, but fighting off consumption with your buds at a sanatorium in the Southwest after the cramped humidity of New York actually sounds kind of nice. They've got all that wet damp back in the old country. Isn't America for something better? Or at least different? This image of Santa Fe as a refuge from the crowded pressures of the East Coast is quite common. And we can find examples of it in even that most embarrassingly American of art forms, musical theater. Consider, for example, the Disney 1992 dramedy Newsies, based loosely on the Newsboys strike of 1899. The film stars a young Christian Bale as Jack Cowboy Kelly, a wily orphan who becomes the Newsies' de facto leader when Joseph Pulitzer, yes, that Pulitzer, attempts to raise the price of his papers. After having dinner with the family of the most recent Newsies, Jack fantasizes about traveling to Santa Fe. So that's what they call a family. Mother, daughter, father, son. Guess that everything you heard about is true. So you ain't got any family. Well, who said you needed one? Ain't you glad nobody's waiting up for you? When I dream on my own, I'm alone, but I ain't lonely. For a dreamer, night's the only time of day. When the city's finally sleeping, and my thoughts begin to stray, and I'm on the train that's bound for Santa Fe. And I'm free, like the wind, like I'm gonna live forever. It's a feeling time can never take away. All I need's a few more dollars, and I'm out of here to stay. Dreams come true, yes they do, in Santa Fe. Where does it say you've gotta live and die here? Where does it say a guy can't catch a break? Why should you only take what you're given? Why should you spend your whole life living trapped where there ain't no future? Even at 17, breaking your back for someone else's sake. If the lights don't seem to suit you, how about a change of scene? Far from the lousy deadlines and the headlines in between. Santa Fe, are you there? Do you swear you won't forget me? If I found you, would you let me come and stay? I ain't getting any younger, and before my dying day, I want space, not just air. Let him laugh in my face, I don't care. Say the place, I'll be there. So that's what they call a family. Ain't you glad you ain't that way? Ain't you glad you got a dream home? Don't you love Alan Menken? He's the composer. We have him to thank for masterpieces such as The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Pocahontas. I can't remember how many times I begged my mom to take me to see Aladdin in the theaters. Do kids still watch this shit? I hope they do. What I appreciate most about Mencken is his timelessness, or maybe that's just the way that we all feel about the music of our childhoods. But I'm supposed to be talking about Santa Fe. Focus. Throughout the 20th century, the city different continued to attract writers and artists with its panoramic landscapes, mild climate, and cultural richness. Cormac McCarthy, Robert Redford, and above all, desert doyen Georgia O'Keeffe have all made homes there, providing fertile soil for another image of the city to take root, Santa Fe as Bohemia. So what do you say? Do you want to meet in Santa Fe? I'm looking at tickets now. You can meet me at the train. If you have any difficulty recognizing me, I shall be the most sophisticated vagabond at the Santa Fe Depot. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brandon. So now we're going to go ahead and open it up to Q&A. If anybody has any questions or any comments about Claudia, Clara, or Brandon's presentations, you can go ahead and put it in the chat, or feel free to speak freely. Like we're not in a classroom. You don't have to raise your hand and wait on me to call on you. You just go ahead and speak.
So while we're getting our questions from the Q&A, and I'm just going to apologize because the best laid plans, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And of course, today they decide to cut the lawn outside my window. And so, of course, there's a grass cutter in the background. If you do have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. We're really excited to hear more from Claudia, Clara, and Brandon. And to start us off, since we don't have any questions in the Q&A, I have a question for Claudia to just, begin the conversation, because that's what this is, right? So Claudia, I realize that you move between English and Spanish very sort of fluently in your poetry. It's something that you did, both ways in your two readings. And I'm interested to know, because clearly, well, to me, you are the border. Like we talked about death at the border, but you are the border in your poetry. And so I'm interested in knowing how you choose to use English. Clearly it's disrupting the flow of the poem. You want the listener to hear something different. And I noticed that I think the phrase you used was a no good something. The English words were a no good something in your Spanish version. And I'm wondering how you make those choices.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's a question that I've actually am constantly trying to come to terms with, because I was born speaking Spanish. That's the first language that I learned. But then when we immigrated to the US, I was a child, so I was about 6 years old. So most of my education started here in the US. And I actually should say all of my education, or anything that I do remember. So I was taught in English throughout school. In college, you have the classroom that just, everything is in English. So I kind of have two versions of myself. The one at home that speaks Spanish, and then the one in academic settings that speaks in English. And what I'm trying to do now is not have that huge line, right? So I want to have things in language intermix. So I started to do that when in my early college years of introducing Spanish into my poetry. And I actually hope that I introduce Spanish more often, because my poems right now are in English, because that's what I'm comfortable speaking. That's what I'm comfortable writing and reading. And I actually wish it wasn't so. Last year, I did a lot of reflection about the linguistic violence that happens to immigrants, particularly young immigrants, when we immigrate and we go into classrooms. At the school where I went to, there's an immersion program, but it's a lottery program. So I wasn't learning Spanish and English at the same time and during the same day. So Spanish was reserved for after school, because my mom put me into a program that allowed me to practice my Spanish. So it is really right now, as an adult, me trying to be intentional of Spanish is my heritage, even though even though Spanish, the language was also, it's a colonized language because El Salvador was colonized by Spain, but it is the language that I had before English. So I wish that I can be more intentional with language, but thank you so much for asking that question, because it is something that I am constantly thinking about. How can I invite Spanish more onto the page, and then also take Spanish more into my life?
Yeah, I think Nancy has questions from the Q&A, but if we don't have many more, I have another question to ask
Oh
you.
yeah, I do too. So we can share. All right. And so another question in the Q&A is, I'd like to invite the wonderful panelists, and this is all panelists, to speak on positionality. How has who you are impacted and been impacted by your work? And this is a question for all of you, so just feel free to jump in when you're ready.
Well, I can start. So, because I think I kind of started answering this question, but who I am is very integral to my poetry. I think at moments I have also discovered who I am through writing poetry. When I really started to learn about my immigration program, the program being it's like the limitations. I was about 17/18, and it was really difficult for me at that time to understand why all of a sudden I was being given all these limits about, like, you can't apply to financial aid, you can't study abroad, and all of that. So I started to write that into my poetry, these questions I had in my experience, and that allowed me to cope. So it became a coping mechanism. And now, like, as I am evolving with my poetry, who I am is still a significant part, because I'm not just my immigration status, I am more than that. So I'm always thinking of the other themes in my life, such as women's rights, family dynamics, especially broken family dynamics, and intergenerational trauma. So I can share that.
And I think I can share. I was born and raised in Venezuela, so some of the topics that I touched in my presentation, namely the Venezuelan exodus, I mean, those are close to my heart, and I think that there's a lot of I think Latin American art is quite unique in the way that it represents issues of destabilized democracy, authoritarian control, and an increase hegemony, especially now in the 21st century. So I think, as a Venezuelan person analyzing a Mexican artist who discusses and tries to document some of the unfortunate conditions that seem to be quite rampant in this region, is, I think, just kind of opens up discussions of how does our study in relationship to Latin American our experiences, politics, exodus, all that, how does that come together?
I can say something. First thing I'll say is, like, sorry for that experience. This is like new work, and I was like, there's a whole part on rent, and I was kind of like live editing to keep within the time. So yeah, I resonate with a lot of what has been said. So I'm a biracial person, I am a queer person, and I feel like I've kind of my whole life had this sort of like not really feeling like I belong in white spaces, not always feeling like I belong in Latinx spaces, not having my grandparents like speak Spanish, my mom and me like not speaking Spanish. So, and I think that this, it's like I'm like interested in also these ideas of like borders in like performance and like creative work. So if you're like a painter and you have paint or you have clay, when you're a performer, it's like you are the medium. So it's like when does like talking start and when does singing begin, you know, because if you were at a piano, I could tell you what pitches you're speaking on. We all speak on pitches. Or there's a lot of, if you look at a lot of modern dance, they're thinking a lot about like when does normal movement, the line between normal quotidian everyday movement and dance. So I feel like that's kind of like that's at once what I feel like I'm trying to get at in the performance, maybe, where it's like, you know, when is something like a lecture, when does it become something else? And also just Santa Fe and the American Southwest in general, which has this like very long history of like different cultures being mixed with one another. And in Latin American studies, like, you know, these ideas like hybridity and stuff are very under discussion.
So we do have a question from the chat that I mistakenly moved from open to answered. And so I just want to read it before it gets lost. And this is for Clara. The asker would like to know how the work has responded to the presence of drug-related violence in Mexico's everyday life. Her work in the first years of the so-called war against drug cartels attempted to create a shock effect to the audience and to insert these problems in a sector isolated from them. This is not the case anymore. Our shock and the evocation of the abject still strategies to denounce violence and rupture of the society. And the next question is actually about activism. So how does her work translate into activism? So if we could do these back to back, I would really appreciate it. And I think everybody else would as well.
Yeah, of course. Just as a background, Teresa Margolles started as part of this group of artists called Semefo, which were named after the main morgue in Ciudad de Mexico. And I think that at first she herself has said that because I think we have to remember she began her career as a mortician. So she herself witnessed how this ineffectual bureaucracy, bodies just coming in and out, you know, she would perform autopsies on bodies that she knew in the end, the perpetrators of that violence wouldn't, you know, there would be no punishment inflicted on them. So I think the beginning of her career was a large scale shock value. And she even used sometimes body parts, but as her career as an artist progressed, she started to become more conceptual and she started to consider rather than, let's say, the body itself, she started to move towards the factors and the politics behind the causes of those deaths. So let's say the social causes behind those deaths. So when she began to exhibit internationally, her shock value is more than anything in the material itself, but it's less about she's moved away from just using pure body parts, but she's moved towards people realizing their own objection to the death, because she'll use filtered water that was used in the morgue. And technically that's safe, right? Water circles in everyday life. So water that was used in the morgue, eventually it will go through our tap. So I think maybe shock value doesn't integrate as much. Now it's more that she's, as an artist, she's kind of standing up to international arenas, and for instance, in the Venice Biennale or here in New York, she'll actively say when she's exhibiting, we should be focusing on these greater issues. Let's try to turn away from aesthetics. And in terms of activism, I think that's an interesting question, because Margolles has, she's actually been quoted as saying that she's not sure that art can cause a change in reality, because as a member of, as a mortician, she herself could do very little change. So she says, as an artist, all I attempt to do is just document and archive and create a memory of these things. And she's hoping that that will be enough fuel to get people to talk about it. There's this great quote by her that says, I think it's important to put the body or the corpse in the gallery space, because it's important to reflect and talk about it. So she thinks that by opening up dialogues, that's what really can enact change. So she herself wouldn't consider herself an activist, but people have said that her art especially when correlated to certain movements like the anti-femicide movement, can help forward activism.
We have some questions about, for you again, Clara, but I would like to sort of have you answer that one question, because as interesting as all these topics are, there's something about the use of death that I think has really, you know, struck a chord. And people are interested in knowing if this is part of a genre, if there are other artists who are also, that you're interested in, who are also doing something similar. So maybe you can think about that for a bit. But I would like Claudia and Brandon to say something. So we're gonna go to Claudia first. And Claudia, I was wondering about your, you know, your move to the US and the idea, because this is really about you. This is about you as an individual, sort of putting yourself on the page. And I think a lot of us as transplants from other parts of the world feel a sense of loss and a sense of grief and not being, you know, at home, right? We're separated from the place that we come from. How does that fit into your, is it disruptive to you? How does it fit into your poetry, that absence? Or is this something that doesn't, you know, filter into the work that you produce?
Yeah, I really like that question, and I think it really digs deep and it cuts deep, because even though I had to leave El Salvador when I was very young, I don't quite have a memory, but I still feel that I live in both places, that I live in El Salvador and that I live in the US. And this is because of family. This is because my mom still very much remembers her childhood, her early adult years in El Salvador, and my extended family is in El Salvador. And, you know, knowing that and the conversations my mom has, I still have 1 feet or 2 feet in El Salvador, because I'm living that life through my mom. So my mom and I would say our families are that connection, and that connection amplifies that loss. So I know that I've lost so much, because if I were to travel to El Salvador, I may not return to the US. But I know the intensity because of my mom. So that is for sure something that I explore in my poetry, because of whenever I explore immigration and just identity and home, those are topics that are very personal to us, and like those are things that we really can't get away from. And I've just decided, like, this is what I want to write about.
So, Clara, is it possible for you? Have you thought about it a little bit? Because I wanted to give you a minute to process the question.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm not aware of other artists who use materials that have directly come in contact with the dead. I think this is what made Teresa Margolles gain a lot of international renown, because of her, albeit controversial choice to use this and the moral implications behind it. An artist that does come to mind is Felix González Torres, because he similarly created charged conceptual pieces that were ephemeral in nature, that would implicate the viewer in the very topics that were part of the thing. He famously created a installation of little candies, and viewers could easily eat the candies, and they were representative of his friend who died of AIDS, or they were representative of some of people who died because of the drug trade. And the idea is, as citizens, or even like drug users, we will say, we will not acknowledge that culpability as the consumers in like the drug economy. And I think Margolles has created works like that, that in a sense make us remember that we're complicit, whether as consumers or as citizens who just on a daily basis say yes to these conditions that disproportionately affect some populations over others.
Yeah, so we're at 16 right now, and we're allowed to go past 20. And so I want to ask Brandon something, because something that I've noticed in both your poems, Claudia and Clara, is that the border seems to be fixed. Like the border is there, and it's like, this is where I crossed, and this is kind of where we're now. Once I cross this border, I still have to face persecution, because the border will keep following me through white minivans, through all of this. But I'm really interested in, Brandon, how you have historicized the border. Like, you are really questioning it. Like, you're looking at these very old colonial maps where like the border was all the way out there. Like, it was all the way out in the Mississippi. Like, and so you're really like having us question, like, you know, this static reading of the border. And so my question to you is, why do you play with the border? I don't know. It came out like so crude, but that's just like, why are you interested in like this movement of the border? Like, what is the greater question that you're trying to get at?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, that's very correct. I'm very frustrated, as I'm sure many of us are, by conversations around migration and stuff, where it's like, oh, well, you broke the law. And like, we have to, like, you know, draw the line somewhere and all of this stuff. And there's probably everyone has read this, but this book by Benedict Anderson, Imagined Communities, where he talks about the way that like the sovereignty has kind of changed over time, where it's like, it used to be that kind of the sovereignty kind of like radiated from the king, and then you get into like the borders, and you're kind of like, I don't really know if I'm in this kingdom or that kingdom. And now we have this, like, it's like, you know, sovereignty, it like extends to this point and then it stops right there, and it's like totally the same. And that's like, that's a very new idea. Also it's like I didn't, you know, it's like I took like AP US history, like I got like a good score on the thing, and it's like I didn't know like this history of like kind of you learn about the Louisiana Purchase and even like Alaska, but like the Mexican Cession, the Mexican American War, and as I'm like learning, and it's like, oh, all these things that like James Polk was doing, and it makes you really appreciate like how contingent and historical these things are. I highly recommend a book by Evelyn Nakano Glenn called Unequal Freedom. And she like looks at, you know, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed, the border moves, they go to all the people living there, living their lives, and are like, hey, do you want to stay in the US, or we can send you back to Mexico? Most of them elected to stay in the US, like with keeping their land, having voting rights. Those things didn't happen. So it's like thinking about, and then, you know, that's just like the beginning of stuff that is continuing to this day. Like the rates of, I'm in Los Angeles right now, the rates of like COVID infection and death are like much higher, educational achievement, in like poverty, all very concentrated within Latino, especially Mexican communities. So yeah, that's kind of like what I'm getting at, I think, with that. And my hope is that the kind of like the form of the, am I listening to a lecture? It's like, am I getting information? Am I like listening to this weird dude like sing karaoke to me? It's like that kind of, for me, gets to that sort of like, oh, I don't know where I am, which I feel like having a little bit more of that, like realizing it's just like this line in the sand could maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I do like that, because it's like we're so, you know, we keep on saying that we want to move away from the canon, but we're still, you know, writing in these very you know, writing with these kinds of papers and that. So I did appreciate this multimedia form, but I want to turn it over to Yudong Shu. Yudong Shu had a question. Is Yudong still available?
I think Yudong was sharing.
Oh, there's Yudong.
Yeah, I'm available. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I just want to say I so appreciate what you guys are doing. This is fantastic. You know, immigrant justice and, you know, this complete obsession, right, with the border to use it to dehumanize immigrants, to basically justify all the crimes, anti-humanity crimes that are committed at the border, at the detention centers and everything, right? It's just atrocious, and we need to speak out. And I myself am actually, well, I study immigration law, and I'm also the co-founder of a movement called Immigrant Justice and Anti-Colonial Coalition. So I realized that you guys have been talking about border, you know, how border has become this, you know, obsession, right? When we try to formulate like immigration policies, but that's completely missing the point, because it's people who are immigrating. It is not about the border. Border is more of a conceptual gap between people who are already in the country, who are citizens for generations, and people who are newly, right, arrivers to the country. But fundamentally, right, I think the thing that defines America is that this country is created by immigration. So whether you're here, right, for generations, or you're only coming here, what you share is the same. That is, you're sharing the process of creating this country. That's why, you know, I have posted in the chat all these OPADs you can read about, you know, how we try to create a more unifying, humanizing narrative, right, to truly push immigration reform in a more progressive way, instead of just, you know, breaking it down into piecemeal, you know, sort of legislations, right? What Biden is doing right now. I think that's not going to help, because we're basically fighting a losing battle. We're on the defensive, not the offensive. And the way to reverse that is to actually talk to people. That's what I'm doing right now. Actually, we're going to launch our healing circle by the end of June to talk to both immigrants who came here and also nativists, people who oppose immigration, to basically get them to sit down and have this difficult conversation, because we need that so much. These people, right, living in the United States, let's say near the border, Texas, you know, Mississippi, Louisiana, whatever, these people, right, their idea about immigration, their xenophobia doesn't come from necessarily their experience with immigrants. I think if they experience...
I think that's wonderful. Like the idea that there is activism that is associated with this perspective is absolutely fantastic. And I really want to thank you for the information that you put in the chat, because there's a lot of follow-up that our attendees can do now that they've actually seen, you know, where this line of thinking goes. So we're actually out of time. I just want to thank Brandon and Claudia and Clara. I just want to sort of, my parting thought is that even as we talked about disruption, everybody went to the border, even if they didn't know that that's what they were doing. We have someone who is the border, we have someone with death at the border, and we have someone who's very interested in having those borders move over time. And so I just think that's something that we can think about as we move forward. Nancy, you want to give your parting thought?
Yeah, I love how everything was connected. The main thing that I saw is border, you know, obviously Mexican American heritage, but also also like Nazi Germany and this documentation of people. And we do often have this rhetoric of the United States being a policing country, but I think that we don't really realize how policed it is unless we have these comparisons where Nazi Germany was literally going around asking people for documentation, which is not so different from what Claudia expresses in her poem, like this fear that immigrants have that at any point, anywhere, they could be asked for their papers. And so, yeah, and so also something that I really like is this performance that that Brandon brought up. It's like, you know, we have this performance, we have these movies, we have this popular fiction that normalizes this border as if it's natural, as if it has always been there. And so I think it's also important to look at how popular fiction, how popular songs even have conditioned us to view some people as belonging and not belonging. So I really just loved this presentation, and thank you guys so much for allowing me to moderate this. I learned so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for coming. Good luck with the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.